It seems under the current legislation in WA that our veterans' legacy is being grossly disrespected. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. What we know is that gravestones are being removed from their plots at Karrakatta Cemetery. In fact, just last week I heard from one lady who'd been out of the state for several years and returned. And when she went to place flowers at her grandparents' graves, she discovered that the headstone had been removed and there was no note to identify where the bodies were buried.
And had she been notified about this or consulted?
No, in this case, headstones are often removed without notifying the surviving family members.
Why would that be? Surely, even if you have to recycle plots because of pressure, and we'll get to that in a second, even if you have to do this, the families need to know.
Absolutely. What we need to remember is that Karrakatta is home to many war graves. We've got diggers there from the First and Second World War, from Korea, from Vietnam, and more recent conflicts. In many cases, there are headstones there for our soldiers, airmen and sailors who died overseas, and their memorials at Karrakatta are the only tangible link we have to their service. It's a great disrespect to our war dead, and it seems that there is flagrant disregard for notifying the surviving family members. Quite often, these gravestones are removed and they're damaged or destroyed in the process, and there is no marker left behind. I can give you a couple of specific examples if you like.
Yeah.
Sergeant Billy Date, who served with the 11th Battalion in Gallipoli. His gravestone, if you visit it today, you will see there is a little white plaque that says that his gravestone has been flagged for renewal. That means his headstone will be removed and a new plot will be dug between his grave and someone else's and a new headstone put in place. There'll be no marker to identify where he is buried. Often in these cases, there are no surviving family members or surviving family members have moved away. But what we're doing is destroying our link to our past, and we're having complete disregard for historical graves in this case.
You make a very good point there. It's more than just not telling and not notifying family members who are alive and want to pay tribute and get to this cemetery, but it's an historic record, and an historic record involving someone who sacrificed for this country.
Absolutely. These are people who gave all. Another example, Sister Mary Nicolay, who trained under Florence Nightingale herself, who served with West Australian forces in the Boer War before we even federated as Australia. Her grave as well is at risk of her headstone being removed and no identification being left to show where her body is buried. This is something I've been pushing for a long time, trying to raise awareness about. I've been asking the Minister and the government to review the Cemeteries Act 1986. It hasn't been reviewed for almost 30 years. The government refuses to even look at this issue. In fact, we've got a rally coming up on the 27th of November where concerned citizens will be rallying here on the steps of Parliament to make their voices heard, that they don't want their grandparents' graves defiled and headstones removed, and that they're concerned that we're erasing our history and our link to the past for these diggers and these servicemen and women who sacrificed all for this country and for this state.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I've made some inquiries today of legislation in New South Wales and Queensland. There are regulations there where they treat the graves of servicemen and women perpetually, so they're protected by any future renewable leasing law updates. Why isn't this the case in WA?
Look, if you ask the Cemeteries Board and you ask the Minister, they'll tell you that people can apply for new leases. That's not the case. I've many representations made to me of people applying for a renewed lease to keep the plot in situ, and the Cemeteries Board are telling these people that their request will be denied if they make an official application. It seems to me that what we need in Western Australia is a review, a full and frank discussion about how we treat the graves of our war dead, and if perpetual leases are part of that, that needs to be part of the review. It seems to me that the way New South Wales handles it is a far better approach than the sort of ad hoc, disrespectful approach that Western Australia takes currently.
The irony too is that if you are a veteran and you've been killed overseas, the War Graves Office will go to a great deal of trouble to look after your recognition in a foreign land, whether that just be where you died, or if they don't know where you died, at a nearby cemetery. They do that, and they do that so well. But just because you get home and you die of some unrelated disease connected to war, you're virtually under review 20 or 30 years later.
That's absolutely right. It's a tragedy. A lot of these servicemen and women, if they're buried overseas, they have an official war grave overseas, you know, perhaps in Normandy or somewhere in Europe. The problem is those wanting to pay their respects. A lot of these people, you know, who are elderly themselves, can't travel to Europe to pay respects to their parents or grandparents. They want to pay respects here in Karrakatta, a local cemetery. It's their only tangible link to those graves and to the service of their family members. Tearing up the link that West Australia has to these servicemen and women, and saying that people should travel overseas to pay their respects is a great insult to those surviving family members.
You see, that's interesting, because there are major cemeteries in states and territories right around the country that have visitations, tours, where they take people around and say, let's talk about the person buried at this plot who was a wonderful poet, someone here who, you know, for instance, at Rookwood Cemetery in Sydney, you can find the person who wrote Waltzing Matilda, and they talk about that. But for some reason, we don't have the same respect for those who fought for the country.
Look, there are special dispensations made for historically significant graves. The problem is that you have a board of so-called experts and bureaucrats deciding what's historically significant. I gave you the example earlier of Sister Nicolay, who trained under Florence Nightingale and who served with West Australian forces in the Boer War before we were a single nation. Her grave is likely, her headstone, unless surviving family members can be contacted, her headstone will likely be removed. God knows what will happen to it, and we'll lose a marker for where her grave is currently.
And her story deserves perpetual recognition.
Absolutely, I think that is a historically significant grave. I think what that woman did is historically significant. It's important to West Australia. It's part of our history. It's part of our culture. We shouldn't be tearing that up.
Aaron Stonehouse MP, thank you very much for your time.